Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's webinar for this month, the first webinar of the month. And today we are pleased to have Felicitas Onetti with us talking about human trafficking. My name is Kimberly Limore. I am on the Executive Steering Committee of the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, and I welcome you on their behalf on today. As always, we will start off with a prayer, and then I will introduce Felicitas, and then we will go on with a conversation. So let us just put ourselves in the presence of God. Today, I have a prayer for the end of human trafficking as shared by the Sisters of Charity of St. Elizabeth, Covenant Station, New Jersey. God of freedom, beauty, and truth, we believe that your deepest desire, your most powerful energy, is that all creation might know abundant life. We raise our voices in anguished prayer for our sisters and brothers, women and girls, men and boys, who are modern day slaves. They are your beloved daughters and sons, exploited sexually or forced to work because of human violence and greed. Fill us with your holy anger and your sacred passion, that those who are trafficked might know healing and justice, that traffickers will come to repentance and conversion, that all of us might live in such a way that others are not made to pay the price for our comfort and convenience. Hasten the coming of the day when all people and our precious earth itself will be treated not as a commodity, but as radiant images of your freedom, beauty, and truth. Amen. Again, I would like to welcome Felicitas Onetti on today. And Felicitas is an anti-trafficking education and outreach coordinator at the Migration and Refugee Services Department at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. She has a long resume, but just to give you a brief understanding of Felicitas, she was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Felicitas has felt always drawn to working with immigrant populations. Felicitas is working to create and expand programs for vulnerable populations such as Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Alaska Native, Pacific Islander, Black individuals to address the needs of each unique community better. Again, we welcome you on today, Felicitas, and we look forward to your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Kimberly, for the introduction and for having me here today. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can you see that? Wonderful. Okay. So today's overview is a little bit on, human trafficking and juvenile detention. So the agenda here. So a little bit of understanding and introduction to human trafficking, the Catholic response, confidentiality, adverse childhood experiences, effects of trauma, risk and protective factors, the intersections between juvenile and criminal justice, some of the awareness raising and the importance. So let me shorten this. So the Catholic Church response to human trafficking kind of focuses on these 4 pillars of education, advocacy, outreach, and services, walking alongside of victims, spreading education and awareness, advocating for the voice, advocating for people, being the voice for the voiceless, fostering outreach and oftentimes having services for victims or perpetrators. Then here, so a big focus is kind of that grassroots, accompaniment and Catholic subsidiarity. And together, these approaches really focus on enabling individuals and target communities to deliver message directly to the peers, using people's gifts and resources to help spread the message against human trafficking, respecting local autonomy, investing in community priorities. There's a really big focus that the church really wants to highlight. And a really big focus when we're working with victims of trafficking is to empower the individuals within that community oftentimes people really, you might hear a lot of, survivor services or survivor communities that really foster change together, and continue that outreach and continue that awareness within the people that have been victimized themselves. So some of the programs we have kind of focus on this idea, and so have local communities respond to the call of action to provide resources, education, etc. And that can be within the different places in which people are serving individuals. So, a brief overview, what is human trafficking? So human trafficking is also known as modern day slavery. In places like Europe and the UK, we talk a lot about, people use the term modern day slavery mostly. In the US, people really say human trafficking or labor trafficking or sex trafficking, exploitation. So it's, of course, a violation of human rights. In the US, it's a federal crime. And anyone, especially for any minor under the age of 18, it will always be exploitation and trafficking because minors cannot give consent. So there are approximately 27.6 million victims being exploited for labor work or sexual exploitation. The range goes from 20 million to 40 million of estimated. This is a crime that is very underreported and doesn't always have the most accurate statistics, so to speak, because of the nature of the underreporting, people, being afraid to report, being a clandestine crime, being a hidden crime. And so it varies a little bit. But what we can kind of argue is that it goes to 27.6. So just a quick overview of what the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is and, what's kind of identified under human trafficking. So the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt, bondage, or slavery. Or another term is sex trafficking, in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. So those kind of fall within the Protection Act. So these are both definitions of trafficking. So the three types of control that are mainly used are the force, fraud, and coercion. So the force includes the physical and perhaps sexual abuse, drug and alcohol dependency, or forcing an individual to use such substances, starvation, isolation, constraint, confinement, debt bondage, lending money to people and them having to pay back. Fraud is the false and deceptive efforts of employment, of marriage, of a better life, kind of the things people call the empty promises. Coercion is the threats of serious harm to the victim or the victim's family, making victims believe that failure to perform an act would result in a serious harm, abuse or psychological manipulation. So this is kind of a nice chart that shows a little bit of everything. So in the top, you have the sex trafficking, and then in the bottom, you have labor trafficking. And you kind of see, it says like domestic servants, farm workers, service, and then you have, massage parlors, sexual acts, brothels. And so all the different types, you see emotional abuse, isolation, intimidation, coercion, economic abuse, and using privilege. And so different ways in which people are kind of in that. So the emotional abuse is the humiliation, calling people names. So kind of the power and control. And so you see this within all different age ranges, and you see this within all different, whether it's sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, both. And so these are just tactics used by perpetrators. So to get kind of into the criminalization within what we see within exploitation and like juvenile or just criminalization in general. So a big one is, prostitution. So in prostitution, it can be very difficult to distinguish whether someone is doing this by choice or if they are a victim of trafficking. So then you have, gang activity. Gangs often, can supplement income through sex or labor trafficking. Then you also can see, gang involvement within environments or communities, sometimes within schools or sometimes within even just like prison systems. Then you have kind of drug sales. Drugs can be forced by victims or by traffickers to a victim, whether that's carrying, whether that's distributing, whether that's transporting, whether that's using even. That the use of drugs can be a control a method of controlling a victim or keeping a victim kind of dependent of the relationship of the perpetrator. Then you see illegal peddling, then theft. A trafficker can coerce a victim into stealing in order to provide, extra income for the trafficker, or for them to be caught, for the victim that is committing theft or committing a criminal act. They would kind of cover for the perpetrator, and so there wouldn't be consequences to the perpetrator. Human trafficking, right? The victim may be required to recruit other victims. We see that a lot. A lot of times people that are within trafficking rings can then be the sole recruiter for, women on women or male on male for jobs and or sexual acts or different kinds of things. Delinquency, sometimes victims who are placed in juvenile detention may be forced by the trafficker to recruit other victims into the detention center. Juvenile status offenses, you see a lot of runaways, a lot of homeless youth, a lot of foster care, child welfare involvement, in which there's a bigger risk factor, and make victims susceptible to becoming trafficked. Then you have child abuse and neglect, continuous, just vulnerable to trafficking. We see a lot the relationship within familial trafficking and the role people within the family system might be exploiting their children, or people within either within the family dynamic or within the family dynamic through outside vendors, right? Perhaps selling their child for sex, or even exploiting their own child for their own means. And then guardianship, we see sometimes that traffickers or perpetrators will apply for guardianship over their victims to continue that domination and to confirm that they can kind of have role over the individual. So adverse childhood experiences, just to kind of give a brief overview. So also known as ACEs. So ACEs have a really lifelong impact on our future, our path into adulthood, can, promote violence and victimization, or can promote perpetration. So ACEs really focus on our childhood, and they are the traumatic events that occur within the ages of 0 to 17 years old. So some of the ACEs that we see are experiencing violence or abuse or neglect in the home, witnessing violence in our home or community, having a family member attempt or die by suicide, exposure to substance use, exposure to mental health problems, whether that's ourselves or someone in the family dynamic, just unstable homes, household members being in jail or prison, or seeing someone within the community kind of within that. So some statistics are 64% of US adults report that they have experienced an ACE before the age of 18, and 1 in 6 adults report having 4 or more. And so this list can be longer. It just depends on, there's a lot of different dynamics that are kind of linked within what ACEs kind of involve. And so the issue is oftentimes these problems, because they aren't dealt with or there's no prevention in communities, they kind of infiltrate our adulthood and can have lifelong impacts, whether that is health problems, mental health problems. A lot of times in the young community, it'll engage in risky sexual behaviors, risky criminal behaviors. And so we see continuous involvement in the juvenile system. And we see a lot of just perhaps lack of cooperation in schools or lack of interest in education. And so it continues to fuel this unstable environment for individuals. So a really interesting statistic was ACE-related health consequences cost an economic burden of $748 billion annually between the US, Canada, and Bermuda. And this, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has a really big, extensive page on ACEs for anyone that is interested in kind of learning more. And they have a lot of facts and kind of prevention methods and things like that. So how trauma impacts the brain. So when people are in really high traumatic situations, whether that's at home in their childhood, or whether this is during victimization, before or after, our brain chemistry and our nervous systems naturally start to kind of build walls or defend themselves or have responses to the situations that we are put through. So when we see victims of human trafficking that are placed in extremely traumatic situations, there is brain chemistry being changed, there are nervous systems being infiltrated, and there are adaptation skills that people will have. So when people are exploited, whether that's in the home or whether they experience a lot of adverse violent experiences or behaviors as a child, it can affect the young person's brain and nervous system development, and then lead to that continuous exploitation and leaves people vulnerable. So trauma really triggers biological responses to stress, right? The fight or flight, people hear that all the time, and can cause alterations to a person's stress system. The effect is that a person is constantly in a state of fight or flight. Traumatized individuals, including children and adolescents, can display changes in levels of stress hormones. There's been studies that say that these stress hormones have been similar to those in combat veterans, right, known as post-traumatic stress disorder. So when children are in really high states of exposure to trauma, there could be just a really downward kind of spiral in the behaviors that they develop through the responses of trauma, and what they decide to do, whether that would be risky, substance use behaviors, coping skills, sexual behaviors, and more, but criminal activity as well. So some risk factors for trafficking that is pretty just kind of general within, whether we talk about maybe young people or just victims in general, or people within the juvenile detention, it's persistent poverty, perhaps lack of education or employment opportunities. Sometimes family breakdown can be unstable. Maybe there's not a lot of family support. There's a lot of, gender, racial, and ethnic discrimination, communities with really high crime or with really weak community ties, such as probably there's a barrier within law enforcement or with task forces or with hospitals or with the providing of services, maybe social workers, things like that, education systems. A lot of times, maybe the low awareness of worker rights, illiterate, you see this a lot, maybe with low education or perhaps people that are undocumented and have language barriers. History of abuse, whether that's within the family system, and naturally migrants, displaced, and people on the move. So children, under the age of 18, their risk factors really go into like the sex, male and female. There's a specific kind of recruitment for young boys and young girls, age of, right, being a minor, if they have a disability, maybe a mental health issue, or perhaps even a physical disability, exposure to negative peer pressure, that can include gangs, or that can include substance use behaviors, or kind of peer pressure within the families, different things like that. Separation from family, right? The runaway, homeless youth, people experiencing or people involved within child welfare system, maybe even running away from their foster homes, living with extended families, separated by migration or separated just by troubles with the instability in the home, position within the family, right? Different cultural practices that could be part of specific family dynamic, and sometimes ignorance and being naive of life outside the family or the community. We see that a lot, maybe in rural areas where they go to a city and they're expecting things to be similar to maybe their hometown, and that might not be the case going to a bigger city. So some of the signs of trafficking really kind of just include, showing fear, anxiety, someone controlling where they go, having limited contact. I want to kind of as a disclosure, a lot of times signs of trafficking can be really general, and can also be signs of neglect or abuse, which can kind of in turn fall under an umbrella. It's very difficult to be the individual identifying signs of trafficking in an individual. If you, from what I'm understanding, is that a lot of this community is people that might be, within the juvenile, working within the juvenile communities in the juvenile detention system. And so a lot of times, the signs of trafficking can also be different signs of abuse, or just maybe general signs of distrust of the person or things like that. Of course, perhaps in a juvenile detention system, unable to leave the work environment maybe doesn't really apply, right? Since if they are not working, or perhaps are in a detention center for the time and whatnot. So sometimes it's being a little more mindful of the situation, and kind of the signs apply more to their time during victimization. So what are some challenges to finding victims? More often than not, due to the nature of the underreported instances of people kind of self-reporting or self-identifying or seeking for help, or someone else identifying them, is the hidden nature of the crime. A lot of times people have a really large lack of understanding and awareness about what human trafficking is, what it means to be a victim, if they're a victim themselves, and kind of all those discrepancies that go around. In law enforcement, oftentimes don't have equipped training or adequate services to to offer, whether that's housing, whether that's, financial services for mental health, whether that's food, shelter, etc. A lot of times solutions can be sending people to homeless shelters, and they can continue to be victimized in those situations. So there's always a pretty big lack of discrepancy or services. People sometimes, if they're victimized in a state like New Jersey, might have to go to Philadelphia to receive services. And how does one get from one place to another with such a long drive if they don't have a vehicle or things like that, or the money to pay for it? So a lot of times media portrays inaccurate stereotypes, right? We see often the stereotype of a kid being, lured in with candy and then they're kidnapped into a white van. And although at one point that was something that was very real and very true, that's not entirely what we see today. So trafficking victims rarely self-identify. And then if questioned by police, victims may not really disclose their situation out of fear or trauma, maybe distress in the community, language barriers, etc. And then, of course, traffickers may be well known in a community. So sometimes within the environment, the perpetrator or the abuser, might be involved in the community, might have a big presence in the community. So it could be very intimidating or scary, perhaps, to tell on this person or say that you were being victimized by them. So again, victims don't often self-identify. Feelings of shame or disgrace, endangering family, mistrust in authorities, believing the situation will get better, communication obstacles, and more. So special considerations with child victims, a lot of times when we are in settings that we are working with the young population, and we may suspect that there may be signs of trafficking, or we may suspect that they are a victim, there's really important perspectives that we need to have as, service providers or as volunteers or, child serving professionals in the capacity that may be. It is very common for children to want to please and respond authority, whether the authority is official or not. There's a really large power dynamic that often falls into these categories of when working with child victims of almost any kind. A lot of times when we see victims of trafficking, there is kind of an alignment or like a parallel with domestic violence, perhaps in a relationship or a parent, an unstable parent in which the parent may be abusive or neglectful. And so the signs can look very similar, right? We see, physical injuries, and that could be within all these three situations. So it's important to kind of be very sensitive to the information that is being shared with you, if there is information being shared, and just considerations of what children may respond. So presentation may be affected by their age or their development, perhaps a response to trauma. When we see individuals that are exposed to really high rates of trauma often, it is very common for people to regress developmentally, emotionally. Their emotional developmental capabilities might be of a fourth grader, but they may be, in middle school or high school. So a lot of times it's really important to consider that, they may be 16, but they may have the developmental capacity of someone younger than that, and have, due to the high exposure of trauma or just development in general. So a lot of times we see trauma bonds with traffickers. It is very common for women that are sexually exploited and girls to consider their perpetrator their boyfriend. We see it a lot in big age gaps of young girls that are dating someone maybe that's over the age of 20, that's maybe 10 years older, 5 years older, 6 years older. They call this person their boyfriend or their partner. And so it's really hard to help that person identify that they may be a victim. So may feel ashamed about what they agreed to do or what happened to them, right? There's always that sense of shame or guilt. It's hard for people to kind of get in tune with the situation that happened to them, the trauma that they experienced, and stuff like that. Lack of understanding of their rights, thinking that they won't be protected, or, out of fear that there will be harm to themselves or to the other person or people in their life. Perhaps the less sophisticated understanding of systems, of, inability to make decisions based on long-term outcomes, more likely to believe threats. So these are just a lot of the considerations that we see with the younger population. So I want to talk a little bit about victimization in two really specific categories and where we see juvenile detention take place. So substance use and crime. So youth who are abused, homeless, experiencing homelessness or experiencing other types of violence like sex trafficking or labor trafficking are more likely to have mental health disorders, or short-term and long-term, and will more often have riskier substance use behaviors for either coping or due to the development during victimization. It is common for perpetrators to lure the young community in through substances if they are already using substances prior, or even bring in substances to drug individuals and then keep them there and have them withdraw so people will stay within that. So youth who are using substances and lack what they need to live will commit crimes to get what they need, right? Then we see a lot of times that people will maybe get involved with petty substance use crimes, such as maybe dealing or transporting drugs, in turn oftentimes non-violent, but because they are in this world, it is very common for perpetrators to use them kind of as pawns. We see a lot. There have been a couple cases that we see in the southern border in which perpetrators will have unaccompanied children and minors carry substances across the border. And because there are some special protections for unaccompanied children, perpetrators don't often get caught, and the drugs will make it to the other side of the border. That can be picked up by other people that are dealing the drugs or selling the drugs. And so there's a lot of different examples in that. We also see women are very susceptible to being drugged for sexual exploitation, or to develop a dependency during their victimization. And so there's a big correlation with substance use and crime. So then runaway homeless youth and crime, because we see runaway homeless youth that are either leaving foster care, whether they're leaving their homes or they're leaving someone that is taking care of them, whether that's grandparents or extended family, because people are spending more time in public spaces, or they are living outside in camps or in homeless shelters. And a lot of times homeless shelters have kind of like a time limit. It's just for sleeping perhaps, and they have to, make the line at a certain time of the day to kind of get a place to sleep. We see that they are in public spaces a lot more often, or are involved in more petty crime, more petty theft. Perhaps they have more of a group environment, and they are more likely to have contact with the juvenile justice system, and perhaps be convicted for offenses that, like truancy, running away, or just petty crime that could involve drugs, or that could involve just, shoplifting or things like that. We also see a lot of times when we have the runaway and homeless youth, because there's no home address, we see the school to prison pipeline, in which they may be unenrolled in school. And then if they commit a crime, and it just kind of continues to create the cycle. So anyone that wouldn't be, people that are just genuinely on the street more, will be in contact with the justice system, one, and two, perpetrators will seek out individuals with unstable environments in which to lure them in and kind of promise a better life, or a home, or food, or things like that. So I want to address confidentiality. So confidentiality is a very important piece of information when we're working with individuals that are of such high risk and have very large exposure to trauma. So confidentiality, for the general part, ensures information that is made available only to those that, have access, a lot of times, whether that would be, paperwork, or whether that would be a specific file or things like that. But even when we are volunteering, or we are working with people that are of high risk of trauma, there is kind of an agreement, so to say, that it's not a conversation that you have outside of the work environment or the service environment. If you probably wouldn't discuss a conversation of a victim of trafficking outside of the place in which the services are being provided. So then ensures information shared by a client will remain private unless there's an ethical or legal exception, a right based on basic rights of the client, and an ethical obligation of the caseworker, service provider, kind of whatever that looks like for the volunteers. So not speaking about situations, especially keeping names anonymous, keeping cities, perhaps keeping the name of perpetrators. It is very common for sometimes cases to be open at the time of maybe discussion, whether there are people still that are in detention centers. Cases can be open or not completed or kind of in process. So anytime that we are working with people that are involved in the juvenile justice system or involved in trafficking, there should be a pretty formal and protective confidentiality to protect the victim of the client, or the identity of the victim, and to protect just kind of the case if it's open and stuff like that. So exceptions to confidentiality, this is a very general and kind of informal informational, depending the state that you are in and what where you are working and what the kind of role is of the people within the service providers, or if you are a volunteer and there's a liaison, however the hierarchy goes within the organization that you are working in. Mandated reporting is something that is it goes by state statute. So to give you an example, in the state of Florida, any service provider, whether that is a hospital, whether that is a school, whether that is services, and almost any, let's say, citizen person that sees or suspects child abuse is mandated to report child abuse to Child Protective Services. Many people don't know that, other than people that are child serving professionals, but it is a state statute, and in theory, everyone would be reporting child abuse or neglect. Oftentimes, because of this mandated reporting case, child abuse is very, in Florida, there's a big identification of child abuse because of the involvement of other people that aren't child serving professionals that would suspect this. So you would have to see, some people would argue that child abuse would be also child trafficking, right? Child sexual exploitation or labor exploitation would also fall into child abuse, therefore be mandated to report. But those are the exceptions to each state and what that requires. Sometimes local PDs have a specific information on that. Schools, juvenile justice systems, detention centers, or maybe even just reentry programs and things like that, you would have to kind of see what the state statute is there. So oftentimes abuse or neglect would overwrite a client's right to privacy, right? If we suspect that someone would be a victim of trafficking, and we want to keep confidentiality of a victim's identity, we would still, if there is being abuse or neglect occurring in that moment, we would want to find the person that would be able to help bring services to the victim. And so there's different moral or ethical issues that happen when client's right to privacy versus abuse or neglect. So again, those are just state statutes that you would have to see what your organization does or things like that. So clients must be informed about obligations to disclose certain forms of confidential information and the potential consequences. Oftentimes service providers or volunteer or even liaisons or people running volunteer groups might say, to the clientele that is there, if you report any harm to yourself or harm to someone else, that is something that you would have to report. And so these kinds of disclosures that would limit your confidentiality. And so letting the individual know, the victim or the client, that anything that they would share would most likely be reported is something to always lay out at the beginning of a conversation or things like that. So again, this is depending on the organization, the state statutes, perhaps the archdiocese or organizations, what the whoever is in charge and what they say specifically about what you should do with confidentiality, with reporting and things like that. So things to consider when talking to victims, always make sure it's a safe and confidential environment, right? You would never want someone to feel unsafe. You would never want to pressure someone into telling you something that perhaps they don't want to say, especially if they may think you are authority and they are, there's a power imbalance. They might have kind of some kind of a fear and might just report because they're scared to get in trouble. If a victim is accompanied by someone who seems controlling, trying to, separate victim from that person, not raising suspicion or confrontation, and not making assumptions about a victim's plan or desired next steps, right? If you would assume that there are some signs of trafficking and that someone would be a victim, you would never make an assumption about what they would do, of what happened, or of what they're going to say. A big problem with victimization of trafficking is individuals being vulnerable and susceptible to stigma. And so when we find ourselves in front of someone that may be a potential victim, we always want to empower them and create a safe environment in which they feel comfortable, which they won't be re-traumatized, in which they won't be, re-victimized. And so it is very sensitive, and it can be very dangerous to maybe assume or make assumptions or suspicions, even to say, oh, I think they might be a victim of trafficking because they have a bruise on their arm. That might not always be the case. So, some background knowledge that is necessary. What is the legal definition of human trafficking in your local PD, in your state government? What are the necessary steps for victims to access assistance? Maybe some states have really good services, whether that's mental health, whether that's shelter, whether that's financial support. And some states maybe lack a little bit of that. A lot of states really work together. For example, DC, Maryland, and Virginia are very close to each other. So there's a lot of shared services for victims. That might not be the case with a place like Texas that is so big. So it's very important to know what's near you. What is your role? What are your professional and organizational protocols? So ideas for partnership. I know we're short on time, so I'll finish this really quick. We talk a lot about multidisciplinary models, task forces, law enforcement, serving victims in different capacities, and having a multidisciplinary team, whether that, the church, the local school, the social services nearby, hospitals, clinics, etc. Recollecting tangible and intangible needs, immediate long-term assistance or short-term, seeking partnerships, creating coalitions, etc. So some action items, reporting that, again, that's something you have to see within the organization you're in, seeking assistance from a group leader, asking for protocols in your group, church, or diocese, check the status of reporting requirements in your state or local police department, or just community protocols. And maybe if your diocese doesn't have a protocol, or your local PD doesn't have one, that could be an incentive to maybe create one based on the requirements and legal statutes. And then these are just some resources, so some websites. Thank you all. I don't know if anyone has.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Felicitas. I know there was one question in the chat that Karen had. It says, can you reiterate the ways in which discussing a conversation where abuse is revealed can cause trauma to a juvenile? The importance of reporting, but done in a very confidential way, and who to report to.
Sure. Yeah. So when we are in a situation in which perhaps someone discloses trauma, being trauma, so a lot of people like to use the term trauma responsive or trauma informed care. So when we are trauma responsive to individuals that we assume, that was thunder, if anyone heard that was very loud. So when we are being in a juvenile detention center, we are going to naturally assume that there's a lot of trauma that is going on, that people have experienced either in their childhood home, in school, within peers, or just kind of in general. So when we are in environments in which trauma is really high, we always have to be very sensitive to the victims that we are working with, to the people we are working with, and that's being trauma responsive, right? Perhaps not assuming, creating an environment where they feel safe, right? Coming with a perspective of not giving advice, maybe not solving problems, but being receptive to the information. A lot of people like to say immersion. A good way is immersing yourself in the situation, being walking in solidarity with the individuals you're working with. You are not, realizing your position, you aren't a social worker. Therefore, it is not your job to solve the problems and give them services. And so you would be in a place of maybe more listening, hearing their testimonies, and creating a space in which they're not judged, in which they're not uncomfortable, which they don't feel forced, and being calm. If someone tells you a story that could be very shocking for you, maybe not, showing that so much, being like, wow, oh my gosh, that is horrible, right? You wouldn't want to say that to someone if that was their experience. Being understanding and coming from a place of, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for being vulnerable. And almost caring for the individual that you may not know, and not wanting to. So the idea of re-traumatizing, making someone feel bad for the experiences that they go through could kind of lead people to bad coping skills, and could lead people to places in which they might engage in risky behaviors in whatever way that may be. So coming from a place of being trauma responsive is almost like, I always like to picture, walking into a safe space and like welcoming that person. If you think, oh, the beach is my safe space, almost like bringing them with you to the beach, metaphorically, and creating an environment in which they may feel comfortable to share, and not pressuring people to share. So the importance of reporting. So there's always an importance of reporting. If we do assume, and we might be like, okay, I think I've gotten really good at identifying trafficking, or I think I really understand these situations. Or someone maybe says, yeah, I have a boyfriend and I'm 15, but they're 24. You might be like, that's interesting. One, that's like not legal, right? You can't really date a minor without like consent. And two, like that's really big age discrepancy. And then maybe they share personal information about the relationship, and they're like, oh no, he can be very aggressive, or I go out with his friends and he doesn't get jealous. Maybe he lets his friends do whatever they want to do to me, or certain things like that, in which you're like, oh, okay, like this might not be a very, so to say, normal relationship. There's ways to do that confidentially, right? You would go to the liaison or whoever would be in charge. Perhaps there's a social worker on site, or there's a community provider, a service provider, someone maybe with authority that you could say, hey, listen, I suspected this based on the conversation they told me. I don't want to, make an assumption. I'm handing over the information of what this person told me. And they might know exactly what to do. A lot of times you can call anonymous tip lines, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. If maybe you're not sure, you would call, right? I always say, if you are second guessing, if you are doubting, right? If you're like, oh, I heard the situation, but I'm not sure, call and maybe, talk anonymously. There's been times that I've even called the anonymous tip line and been like, hey, this situation happened. I'm not entirely sure if this would be trafficking. Would this qualify as trafficking? And they might say yes, and they might say no. And so then you can go from there. Always, I guess, or on the side of caution, right? Always wanting to protect people is important, and communicating that with whoever's in charge, whoever you are with, and sometimes reading the room and the environment. If on a different note, if you're outside with having lunch with your family and friends, and you identify someone that may be a victim, you might not want to call the police in that specific moment, especially if they are with a perpetrator. You might want to give someone the phone number, or maybe let them know that if there is anything that they may need, that you would be happily able to provide information. So it kind of varies. I think using awareness and kind of common sense on that capacity, and always being available to provide information, is important. And not always jumping to the assumption that someone is a victim, and you never want to put someone more at risk than they already may be. I know that was a very long response, but trying to highlight.
I think that she's nodding, so I think that answers her question.
Okay,
there was a lot of information that was given. I'm
Anybody
sorry.
can hear?
Robert, you want to go ahead?
Is anyone hearing? Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, good. I got a question and a short comment. Okay. My comment, my question is, I went to see this movie on Tuesday called The Sound of Freedom.
Yeah.
And I'm a Vietnam veteran. And with the young lady that's giving the talk and the sharing, uh, there were two important words I heard from her. One of the words was ignorance, and the other one was PTSD because of our veterans. Well, being a Vietnam veteran, I went through a lot of PTSD, a lot of things that, maybe a lot of other people have never been through. So, in my understanding, I go out and I do uh, ministry in the streets with the youth. I used to go to a juvenile lockup in Oregon, but because of COVID, we don't go. I don't go anymore. So I do my ministry when I go out in the streets, or I go down to the park, so I see the youth. So I just want you to know that there was a question in one of the schools by the youth in the 11th grade, and it was because I was a Vietnam veteran. She didn't have a question. When she came to school that day, she said to me in class, in front of the whole class, and this is very important, ladies and gentlemen. The main question is, what is the meaning to life? That was her question in high school. And all of these youth that are going through life through trauma, sexual, um, you know, evil, and all of this stuff, they have to know what the answer to that question is. And I love to do acronyms. And the key word is life. In an acronym, I will tell you the meaning to life. Living / loving in faith / family / friendships every day / eternally. That is the meaning to life on earth. And a lot of these perpetrators, and mostly men, they do not understand that because they are ignorant. They are ignorant. So we have to educate them through our experience and information that this young lady is sharing with us. So I want to thank you. This has been a beautiful experience for me because I have never listened to this young lady who came from another country. So God bless you. God bless America. And let us keep praying and praying the rosary. That is the key. So please help us to better the world. I love you all. I love our Catholic faith.
Thank you, Robert, for that. There was a lot of information shared, and Felicitas, can your slides be shared? At least that resource page be shared with the group that signed up
Yes,
for
absolutely.
this. Thank you. Thank you. And Gary had a question about, is there a list of each diocese who has an existing partnership program, or who can we contact to get this type of information?
So unfortunately, from what I know, there isn't. So I work for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and we have some programs that we have currently in the anti-trafficking program. And some dioceses will have, so we have a specific program that is tailored to parishes and dioceses that's called Become a Shepherd. That's educating the, parishioners, priests and lay religious people that are involved in the church, and kind of promoting outreach and services. Maybe not so much services, but outreach. A lot of times, so I guess to answer your question, no, I don't think that I don't have a list of all the dioceses that may have it. We see a lot that dioceses that do have maybe Catholic charities or Catholic social services or other things will have different services that are tailored more to like domestic violence, to intimate partner violence, family domestic violence, things like that. Not specifically human trafficking. That is a project that I'm trying to expand and get, do some training within dioceses and do some training within Catholic schools, to foster this prevention and outreach and information. So I would be happy to, as information goes along, send this information for everyone to kind of get it. But this is a great thing to maybe bring up to your diocese, right? To see if there is any prevention information, if there's any outreach services, if there's any anyone that might be helpful for the case that there is a want or a no. And so a lot of the partnership programs is more of an encouragement. We partner a lot of police task forces at the local level have a lot of the partnerships. Perhaps they partner with a Catholic church that is local to that area, or they partner with a Christian denominational church or anything like that, or they partner with schools or different services or organizations. So it kind of maybe check your diocese website and see if there's more information on it there.
And sometimes if you check, like in Chicago, we have a Protecting God's Children, even though it was meant for the clerical sexual abuse, there's other areas that are protecting kids and vulnerable individuals from things like trafficking. So you might want to check your diocese for that division or department as well. Also, Arlene put in there, hospitals, especially emergency departments, have protocols and train nurse responders. Trafficking.
Yeah. So hospitals do have oftentimes, hospitals more often than not have training for, it is like a required training protocol for nurses and kind of practitioners anywhere to maybe be responsible of identifying a victim. They also get trainings for child sexual abuse and child abuse and just any forms of abuse, whether that's adult protective services or things like that. Nurses are mandated reporters by law legally in most states. Most hospital providers, 82% of victims do seek medical services, whether those are rape kits, whether those are, for injuries, whether that's for testing, for pregnancies, etc. So hospitals are pretty equipped for the most part with a lot of training and services and information. So they are an expansion of some of the work we are doing is getting that information out into Catholic hospitals as well, and just general hospital services. More often than not, nurses and healthcare practitioners have to report. And so they automatically report that stuff to the National Human Trafficking Hotline or to OTIP, which is the Office of Trafficking in Persons from the Department of State. OTIP usually works a lot with foreign nationals and things like that as well too. And so it depends, a lot of times you have, behavioral therapy service hospitals, right? Psych wards and things like that, in which people are victimized as well. And so there are protocols in place for practitioners that are different from what a school would do or what an organization would do, just because they might have police on site or they have a victim in their care at that moment in time. So it can be very specific and tailored to that event. But yes, hospitals usually do a pretty good job, but there can always be more information shared.
Right. Thank you, Felicitas, for all this useful information. She put the telephone number to the National Human Trafficking Hotline in the chat, so you can write that down before you leave. And of course, again, we thank you for sharing your time and your knowledge on this important subject about human trafficking, especially in the era of our juveniles. Take care, everyone.